Scientists suggest that what we experience as reality might be only a computer simulation, and that we may be no more than computer-generated characters within a matrix. If that were so, they ask, how would we even know? For similar reasons, I wonder how we might awaken to the possibility we are not free citizens in a democracy, but victims of a protection racket controlled by a crime syndicate. Again, how would we know? I suppose a clue would be if our supposed leaders came to be associated in the minds of more and more people with behaviour that just looks criminal. As a for instance, look at the Scottish National Party. Members of a government, senior officials of that government's governing party, arrested and questioned by police in relation to the party's finances. What suspicions might be raised in the minds of income tax-paying, council tax-paying citizens, while officers dig holes in the back garden of the leader of the country, apparently in search of evidence of crime? During the past 3 years, we saw over and over elected politicians and their officials insisting citizens must obey life-altering regulations while they themselves routinely ignored them. Our Prime Minister, in a time of war, discouraged firms from doing business with Russia, while his own family continued to profit from doing exactly that. Our Prime Minister has presided over the implementation of taxes for hard-working citizens, while he takes advantage of a much lower rate made an option by his great wealth. What does that look like to people struggling just to keep their heads above water? Imagine how people might look on at such things and say, that's criminal. In a protection racket run by a crime syndicate, hapless souls have no alternative but to hand over funds to an organisation that makes plain failure to do so will result in dire consequences. Income tax, value-added tax, council tax, small business tax, inheritance tax. The only benefit on offer for handing over the cash to protection racketeers is being left unmolested until the next payment is due. Victims of the racket are kept in a perpetual state of anxiety, distracted by the grim necessity of earning enough money to live and keep a family, while somehow managing at the same time to have enough surplus to pay for the protection from harm. What's that, you ask? Men can be women? We owed reparations for slavery? The countryside's racist. The planet will catch fire unless I give up my gas boiler. We're going to war with who next? Give me a minute, because right now I can't afford to feed my children. As someone only recently awake to what's going on, I look back and wonder just how much I've missed over the years. But at the same time, I'm sure the powers that be used to be better at pretending to have our best interests at heart. Now their disdain and contempt are overwhelmingly obvious. The prices of food, fuel and energy keep going up while the wholesale costs of those commodities are coming down. Imagine how people might learn of such things and say, that's criminal. It's almost as though life is deliberately being made harder by those with the power to make it so, at a time when life might be made easier. It turns out Build Back Better didn't apply to you and me. Instead, after 3 dreadful years, consumers pay more and more while the profits harvested by the providers of those commodities go up and up. Is it just me, or was the pretence of compassion better once? Is it just me, or are we being invited to know in no uncertain terms that our noses are being rubbed in the abuse of power? All manner of freedoms are being eroded. The simple freedom to jump in the car and go where we want looks set to be made a thing of the past. Not to worry though, soon all we could desire will be within a 15-minute walk of our homes. For those still clinging to notions of democracy, consider the World Health Organization's Pandemic Preparedness Treaty, by which our country will be bound by May 2024 unless action to the contrary is taken. The WHO has 192 member states. It sits in Geneva, where its representatives pay no tax and enjoy diplomatic immunity. They are unelected and unaccountable. Over 80% of WHO funds come not from member states, but from so-called stakeholders, big pharma and the like. Influence over the WHO is for sale to the highest bidder. The second biggest funder is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. By the existing paperwork, the WHO at least pays lip service to democracy, but by the terms of proposed amendments to the existing treaty, they seek fundamental change. If the new treaty is ratified, the WHO will decide when to declare a world health emergency. The WHO will define what is misinformation. The WHO will have the legally binding power to enforce lockdowns and vaccinations. The WHO will have the power to force companies here in Britain to produce and export medical products to the wider world. Declared respect for human rights and dignity will literally be erased from the treaty and replaced with vague assurances about equity. All of this will come about unless our government acts to the contrary before the treaty is made binding in May next year. I suppose the question is, do you want you and your children living under the protection provided by a racket like the WHO? But let's pause for a moment to think how we might have got here. Almost invariably, an unchallenged crime syndicate grows more and more blatant. At the same time, absence of a challenge leads to complacency. Things have been going our way for a long time, they think. Therefore, we might assume things will always go our way. Unbridled audacity and careless complacency can also lead to unintended consequences. I noticed that the pain of the last 3 years followed events that might have been interpreted as unexpected defiance on the part of people assumed to be living meekly under the yoke. Back in 2016, there was a referendum about membership of the European Union. A person might say complacency saw the government of the day assuming it had the result in the bag and so allowed the plebiscite to go ahead. Let the little people think they have a say, bless them. Instead, a majority voted to leave that European Union. That same year in the USA, Hillary Clinton had expected the keys to the White House. In fact, assumed they were hers by right. So complacent was she described those supporting her opponent as a basket of deplorables. A majority of those deplorables chose Donald Trump. Here in the UK, in the aftermath of the vote to leave the EU, all manner of forces were mustered to defy the largest popular vote in the history of these islands. Heaven and earth were moved to undo that which had been done. While it proved impossible to set aside the vote and rejoin the EU, it turned out that technicality did not matter. Brexit happened in name only. As things turned out in every way that matters, the UK has remained in thrall to the panjandrums of the EU. In the United States, heaven and earth were moved to oust that Donald Trump from the White House. All the tricks, the CIA, the FBI, Facebook and Google and more were deployed to try and rid the US of that most turbulent president. I look back on those events, that referendum and that US presidential election happening so close together and notice how much changed in the aftermath. So much. We experienced a sequence of events few of us might have predicted in our wildest dreams. I hardly need to list them, but what the heck, for old time's sake. A global pandemic, confined to our homes for 23 hours a day, livelihoods destroyed, health and well-being ruined, travel bans, an internationally coordinated bid to inject every man, woman, child and infant on the planet with a brand new medical product that makes billions for Big Pharma. The greatest transfer of wealth in history, unprecedented creation of currency and disastrous devaluation in the process, the looming prospect of the end of cash and its replacement with digital currencies controlled by privately owned, secretive and unaccountable banks, 15-minute cities, the psychopathic acceleration of net zero, the prospect of digital IDs, of surveillance society, of one world government, making racism the height of fashion again, as long as it's anti-white racism, of the return of war to the European mainland and the threat of its escalation to envelop the world and to trigger the blossoming of nuclear Armageddon. In idle moments, I wonder if those world-changing developments would have arrived as, and more importantly, when they did, if UK citizens had voted to stay in the EU and if their American cousins had voted to install another Clinton in the White House, if we hadn't been so many flies in their ointment. What then? Call me a conspiracy theorist by all means. Nowadays, that's a badge I wear with pride. And so where are we now? Well, we have Joe Biden and the surreal goings-on of his administration. The man is cognitively unfit. His family are enveloped in scandal regarding business dealings with Ukraine and China. The US seems to have no functioning southern border. Tens of millions of strangers flow across in an unchecked stream. Cities are surrendered to crime. They know we can see, and yet even that doesn't seem to matter. Citizens questioning the decay are dismissed as far-right extremists and racists. Here in the UK, protesters challenging Mayor Sadiq Khan's ruinous ULEZ scheme are slandered as far-right by the BBC. Victims of the medical products pushed as vaccines, all those uncounted dead and the injured, are ignored by all but a handful of MPs. Their plight is likewise dismissed by the vast majority of the mainstream media. A protection racket is about fear. the determination to make good on threats, and perhaps most importantly, the acceptance on the part of the victims that they are vulnerable and alone in the face of overwhelming power. Fiat currencies and fractional reserve banking are Ponzi schemes by any other name, and in any other context would be regarded as criminal. Try setting up your own equivalent and see what happens. Just because a government decrees a situation legal does not in any absolute sense make that situation lawful. What it comes down to in the end is whether enough of the people accept the moral authority of those presumed to govern them. I ask myself whether our so-called leaders have the required moral authority. Always now, I find the answer, at least for me, is no. They do not. They do not. Here's the thing. If so-called leaders who, by their own actions or by the actions of those to whom they are linked, invite the attentions of the police, if so-called leaders bully and threaten citizens into behaving one way while they themselves feel free to behave another, if so-called leaders are deaf and dumb in the face of terrible harms and suffering, if so-called leaders grow rich via the same system that impoverishes those below them in the hierarchy, I say those are not legitimate to wield power over us. All of which begs the obvious question, why are we paying for this fraud? Why are we financing what we know to be iniquitous and wrong?